Welcome everyone back to Behind the Front Line, and we have got more great news coming from the Eastern Front today, as that Russian offensive or assault that occurred near the Svatove area over the past 7 to 10 days is being repelled and reversed, with many positions that had been taken by the Russians being recaptured by the Ukrainian forces, with the advance of the Russians now confined to as much as a kilometre in some areas. Now, if we do zoom in on the deep state map, there hasn't been an update today, unfortunately. But you can see yesterday it was updated so that Nadia was recaptured by the Ukrainian forces, Novogorivka was recaptured, and getting Novogorivka into the grey zone. And you can see where the Russian line, or the front line, was initially before this offensive action. It was along this river line here, and as we highlighted yesterday, it was about a 2-kilometre advance. But we are hearing updates from other sources that this line has been pushed back even further. Now, if we go over to Syriac Maps here, who is a well-trusted and pretty accurate reporter for the front line and is pretty conservative, only reporting on something when there is strong evidence for it. You can see that he has pushed his map back even further, with some of the biggest advance still maybe just around that kilometre or less than kilometre mark. Here, not quite got Nadia under Ukrainian control, but pretty much the Ukrainian positions are now on the outskirts, if not pushing Nadia into the grey zone. Those two villages further south was completely recaptured. Now really the only Russian positions on this side of the river are these various fields to the south of Rehorodka here, and further south was a few fields as well, but more Ukrainian advances down from the hills to the west here. Again, just signs that this assault, this attempt at some sort of bridgehead across the river is being completely halted and being reversed. I didn't actually expect to see much of a reversal because of all the Ukrainian troops committed to the southern front and towards the Bakhmut area. I did think that they would pour in reserves to stabilise the front, but I didn't expect to see this much of a counterattack this quickly, just showing you that the Russian attack was either badly planned or had very poor artillery and logistical support, really only preying on the hope that the Ukrainians would retreat. But instead, the Ukrainians retreated to reserve men and reserve equipment before the reinforcements arrived, and they've battered these Russian infantry units back towards positions near the river. And the only really big reason for this attack, as we said yesterday, was to have established positions to the west of this river. The front line at the moment does mirror this river quite significantly, especially to the south here, along this front. And the Ukrainians have a bridgehead on the east of the river here, and that's why we saw attacks towards Torske over the past month or so, which have been fairly unsuccessful. Some grey zone has changed, but really no significant territory taken. They've tried further northwards, and they had got a bit of a bridgehead here. And further northwards as well here, we have some positions that are either side of the river. So really, this was an attempt for the Russians to have a proper foothold on the western edge of the riverbank here. Enough of a foothold that allowed tanks and other heavy equipment to cross the river without being under intense Ukrainian artillery fire. That was the whole purpose of this assault, and from the looks of it, it has failed. A 1-kilometre buffer zone is not enough to withhold the majority of Ukrainian artillery, let alone even mortars or even direct fire from infantry. So yes, not a successful bridgehead attack here, and it's looking like the goals of this assault have been completely demolished. We'll have to see what happens, whether the Russians try and reinforce the front, but if they had tried to reinforce it, we probably wouldn't have had seen these gains over the last couple of days from the Ukrainians. So perhaps this was an attempt at an assaulted attempt at trying to see if the Ukrainians were weak on this front, making an initial breakthrough, but really getting pushed back as soon as those Ukrainian reserves did move in. Other sources have also claimed that the Russians attacked when there was a troop rotation on the front, i.e. where experienced troops on this front line rotated out with newer, less trained troops to the front line, and the Russians attacked at that point. So really, the weakness here was the troop rotation that would have to have happened to make sure troops are fresh. So really, Russians tried to capitalise on this situation, but have pretty much failed, and I'll be very interested to see if this front line gets completely pushed back to that river line over the next few days, the next few weeks. Elsewhere along the front line, we haven't seen an update on most of the maps today, so no huge updates in territorial changes, but towards the Bakhmut area, still big attacks towards Andriivka and Kurdyumivka. Again, these areas are pretty much in the grey zone now. The Russians may still have a few positions there, but they're not particularly tenable at all. Same towards Kurdyumivka, which is really under the fire control of the Ukrainians, both from the north and the west, and I suspect that Russians are getting prepared to withdraw to the eastern side of this railway line. That's already reported to have happened in Andriivka, but it hasn't been updated on any of the maps yet, as the information coming out of these regions is still quite uncertain. No big changes towards the Klishivka area. It does sound like, from what I'm hearing, that the Ukrainians have ceased making any major assaults on this village, as the Russians keep sending waves of reservists here. So it's looking likely that the Ukrainians are just going to continue to bombard it with artillery and mortar fire, and of course repel any attacks on these very strong defensive positions. You can see it here. It's not particularly detailed, this map, unfortunately, but this white area here, that is a very strong defensive network of trenches, and that's pretty much where the Ukrainians have got to, overlooking the village, and have halted their advances now, primarily firing on the positions, trying to demolish as many reserves as possible. So no major changes on the Bakhmut front, but things are still evolving, fighting is still happening, and these three villages are very close to falling and probably will fall, definitely Andriivka and Kurdyumivka, in the near future from the sounds of it. Elsewhere, no significant changes towards the Staromayorsk area. Still Russians counterattacking here, and a bit of a grey zone towards the south of this village. And once again, this front is starting to look like it could collapse. Again, stated this yesterday that this Russian controlled zone near Novodonetsk. Most other maps actually have more Ukrainian control here, or more grey zone. Again, putting Novodonetsk in a bit of a pocket at the moment, as I've heard reports said yesterday of fire control from the Ukrainians over this road, meaning that getting support and getting supplies to Novodonetsk will get increasingly difficult. So I suspect they are beginning to draw up plans to withdraw from this area, perhaps setting up the next front line towards these villages here. Pryutne really is now in a pocket. If the Ukrainians do get round and cut off these supply roads, then Pryutne will fall. But the other thing with Pryutne is it's really connecting all these villages to the west, to Pove, Vishnivy. These villages here are really connected by Pryutne. Yes, they can go through the south, but look how close these roads are to the front line. These will be under Ukrainian fire control if Pryutne falls and this offensive line does drop away. So if Pryutne does fall, which is looking likely in the near future, given the amount of pressure being put on it, then we're likely to see big changes on this western edge of the front line as well, just simply from a logistical standpoint, because there aren't that many roads connecting them together, making it impossible really to hold many troops here without them running out of supplies. So this front line is looking very, very volatile at the moment. I suspect there will be some big changes in the near future, but the maps are very reluctant to report it, as it is a very big situation that is repeatedly changing. Towards the Robotne area, reports are counterattacks continue from the Russians, and the Ukrainians have halted their large advances at the moment, trying to consolidate any gains they have made in the last few days. Again, the Russians have pushed back out of Verbove from the first line of defence, pushing away those Ukrainian assaults and probing assaults. And that is the same towards the south of Robotine here. The most intense fighting is in this grey zone, as if the Ukrainians can control this, they'll be able to assault Robotine from the north and the east. But if the Russians retake this territory, or at least have more control over it, it'll mean the Ukrainians can only attack from the north, which has been fairly unsuccessful so far in the past few weeks. Finally, towards the Piatki area, continue assaults happen towards Serebianki and Lhove, coming from the fields here, but also directly from the villages, but no real major gains in the last day or so. Elsewhere, we're still seeing big attacks, missile attacks from the Ukrainians and drone attacks, even into Russian territory now, and that is going to be something we have to really keep an eye on over the next few days, the next few weeks, as that could bring more escalation to this war. And again, reports that a Russian bridge, a Russian control bridge in Crimea was blown as well, again putting pressure on the supply lines of the southern front. So no major changes today apart from that eastern front towards the Svetove area, but I do suspect that we will see some more map changes in the near future, as we are still seeing some intense fighting and very volatile situations, especially on that southern front, with some big battles to be fought in the near future as the Ukrainians ramp up their assaults to try and make that proper breakthrough and head down to the Azov Sea. So thanks for watching, hope you have enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you again for another update soon.